Hello students, this is Professor McDermott with your video recap of our Module 3 discussions, and we had some quite good discussions this time. Glad to see you guys are really getting the hang of this, starting to mix it up a little bit, and have some fun with this. Enjoy the chance to express your own opinion and let your voice be heard. Anyway, we got a lot of juicy material, so I think I will just save the announcements this time for the news posting and the email that I'll send out along with this. So please do read those carefully. But let's start with this issue of the slave trade. Obviously, earth-shattering event in human history, the creation of racial slavery for the first time. Slavery had always existed, but it had never been linked with any one particular race. But beginning with the Portuguese in the late 15th century, slavery becomes associated with Africans. And so let's investigate a little more closely how this played out. Group 1 had two documents. One was by Captain Thomas Phillips, and he was a captain of a slave ship, and so he gives us a very valuable and horrifying document about the way that the slaves were treated. And I asked the group to come up with two examples of suffering undergone by the Africans as part of the slave trade, and also two excuses that Phillips makes, because Phillips, like all Europeans, had an image of himself as a civilized Christian humanitarian man. So how could he possibly accept the kind of horrible suffering that was being inflicted? Well, he had to go into denial, and he had to make excuses, claiming that the slaves really were not being mistreated. And so, Alexis Bieri, you had a very good post here that brought in both the suffering and the excuses made by Phillips. Quote, "The Africans who were caught up in the slave trade underwent suffering. One way that they underwent this suffering was after they were purchased. They were marked on the breast or shoulder with a hot iron. Phillips makes an excuse for this, saying that the place they were scalded with the iron was first anointed with oil, so when the iron touched them it was not as painful. He said that the mark was usually well within 4 to 5 days, and that afterward it would appear very plain and white. He was justifying the fact that he was scorching people. Another way that the slaves were tortured is by being chained up on the ships, and also by the bland food that they were given. Phillips makes the excuse that they have to be chained up because otherwise they would escape, usually to jump into the ocean and commit suicide. And he said that the slaves love the food and that it is the best diet for them because it does not give them diarrhea. I personally do not think they like the food. I think that he was just making an excuse for the terrible food they were given." So you see here the ways that Europeans justified their own behavior to themselves, claiming that the suffering was really not happening, or it really wasn't as bad as it seemed to be. The second document they had was by Brother Luis Brandeon, who explains why Europeans thought it was legitimate to take Africans into slavery. And here again, they had to come up with a very detailed rationalization for this. And the rationalization was that supposedly all Africans who were taken into slavery had been captured as prisoners in a just war. In other words, they were the aggressors who had attacked other people, and the other people, in the process of defending themselves, had captured them, and then they had the right then to sell them into slavery because they had forfeited their lives being the aggressors in this war. Now, of course, that was not really the case in nearly all instances. That it was a rationale. It was a way for Europeans to convince themselves that what they were doing really was justified legally and in the sight of God. And so I asked Group 1 what they thought of Brandeon's argument. Deborah Jacobs, you had a good post here. My response to Brandeon's argument would be that the buying or selling of another person is not justified under any circumstance. The fact that some Africans were captured by their opponents during war should not have been an automatic ticket to be sold into slavery. However, given the common practice of the time, the Europeans could buy and sell the slaves with a clear conscience because they were not privy to where the slaves originated from, and the fact that if asked, most of them would not say that they had been captured legally. So, in other words, because the Europeans really didn't know where these slaves were coming from, that gave them maximum deniability. They could pretend that they were all captives in a just war, and that eased their Christian consciences. You see how we human beings have this great ability to rationalize almost anything that we really want to do, even if somewhere deep down in our being we really know it's wrong. Thank you, Group 1. Nice job. Group 2 had a document by a missionary, a Christian missionary who worked with slaves in the West Indies. His name was Christian Oldendorp. And Oldendorp talked with the African slaves, and he learned quite a bit about the slave trade, which he set down in this document. And one thing this document shows is the surprising truth that nearly all the Africans who were taken into slavery were first captured by other Africans, and then, and only then, were they sold to Europeans. And so we get a glimpse of the African role in the slave trade in Oldendorp's document. Jemiah Peters, you had a very nice post here. Quote, Oldendorp sees other Africans as responsible for the slave trade because they essentially supplied the Europeans with slaves to be sold and bought. It was not uncommon for two neighboring countries that were at war to sell their prisoners of war to the Europeans. The Amina merchant that Oldendorp spoke with would capture his debtors' family members after 3 months of non-payment, and would sell them into slavery as a way of paying off the original debt. Again, a sign this had nothing to do with a just war. Negro merchants often traded slaves, tiger pelts, and ivory in return for weapons, powder, lead, and iron and rum. Also, each nation had to fight against other nations coming into their territory for the sole purpose of kidnapping to supply slaves to the Europeans. End quote. So you see that the Africans really did play a big role in taking other Africans into slavery because of the rivalries among the different tribes and nations. They were trying to get the upper hand, to get an edge by making friends with the Europeans so that they could use European weapons, for instance, against their own traditional enemies within Africa. And the slave trade was a very useful way for them to do this. And so, strange as it may seem, that's how it came about. I asked Group 2 then, who did they think was most to blame for the slave trade, Europeans or Africans? And you guys really grappled with this very difficult question in a wonderful way. Some people in the group blamed the Africans, saying that they should have united against the slave traders. But others saw that there were reasons, important reasons, why the Africans did this that had to do with their own survival. Jasmine Lopez put it this way. I still believe that the Europeans played a major role in twisting the slave trade into their favor, abusing their advantages. Like any other nation in the world, African nations have a desire to flourish in economy. The slave trade with foreigners could easily strengthen any African nation's economy. Even if an African nation refused to sell its slaves, the Europeans would not go back to their country disappointed, but rather move on to another African nation to trade with. Slavery was the normality for Africans for centuries, and not participating with the Europeans could mean harsh tensions and a sharp drop in economy. In a business aspect, Africans needed the slave trade to boost up the economy while competing with other local areas. Not much evil about that, just a desire to prosper. So you see the motivations here. And also Unpa, our chair this time, had some really impassioned and excellent posts about how European demand drove the slave trade and how the Africans were only acting in their own economic self-interest. And Will Payne, you also made a very important point, that when the Africans sold their own people into slavery, they really didn't know the kind of harsh conditions that were awaiting these slaves in the New World. African slavery was much milder than slavery, especially in the New World, especially in the sugar plantations of the West Indies. And so perhaps they simply didn't know what they were sending their fellow Africans into. All right, nicely done, Group 2. Let's move on to Group 3. They had a text from the very famous autobiography of Olaudah Equiano, an ex-slave who became a free man and then later wrote his autobiography based on his experiences in slavery and became an important leader in the abolitionist movement in Great Britain, and a Christian. So I asked them to describe 3 types of suffering that Olaudah Equiano depicts in his book, and the answer was posted by Rita Reynolds, who I really want to thank heartily and gratefully for stepping in again as chair. Really appreciate your help, Rita. Excellent job. Here's the answer. As a group, we had many answers, but we all came to agreement on these 3 types of suffering that African slaves felt while being imprisoned during the Middle Passage. 1. Slaves were beat some to death, and others nearly beaten to death. 2. Slaves were required to remain in unfavorable conditions below deck where it smelled horrible and was unsanitary. 3. Slaves were severely malnourished because they were afraid to eat the food provided, and the food provided smelled bad and not what they were used to eating. So many types of suffering, but in spite of that, the English people, once again, who took these Africans into slavery, would have believed that they were actually doing the Africans a favor, strange as that may seem. And I asked Group 3 to imagine, they were an Englishman or an Englishwoman of that time, why would they think that Olaudah Equiano had actually gotten an opportunity by being kidnapped into slavery and taken ultimately to Great Britain? Why? How on earth could they think that? And how would Olaudah Equiano reply to that argument that he was better off for having been a slave? Joanne Tillman's post reads like this: I think that if I were an Englishman, I would argue that they were better off being slaves because they were now in a better country. They would be forced to work, but at least they would have shelter and not be poor. Also, they should be glad that we allowed them to work instead of killing them. And D'Amber Shorter adds, quote, I would argue that Equiano was better off being a slave because of the experiences that it gave him. Without these experiences, he would not have become a famous author, gained his freedom, or a leader in the anti-slavery movement. He would have continued being a slave and eventually killed himself because he wanted to die. And that's in a nutshell. I think that the English thought they were doing the Africans a favor by bringing them to a more civilized country where they would be exposed to new things, to English culture, and especially to Christianity. And it is certainly true that if this had never happened, we wouldn't have Equiano's great book. But you have to wonder what Equiano would have said about this and whether he wouldn't have been happier back in his own country, not having experienced the horrors of slavery. And Ramona, you mentioned a quote from Equiano's article that I think says it all, and I want to thank you too for the great help you gave in moving this discussion forward, Ramona Thielen. Here's the quote that she pointed out from Equiano: "O ye nominal Christians, that is, ye fake Christians, Englishmen, might not an African ask you, learned you this from your God, who says unto you, do unto all men as you would men should do unto you? Is it not enough that we are torn from our country and friends to toil for your luxury and lust of gain?" End quote. So I think that says it all. Equiano really points out the hypocrisy of Christians who are able to excuse their own inexcusable behavior towards the Africans. All right, fantastic job, everyone. Really looking forward to the next round of discussions. Thanks.